Hello everyone, welcome to HIM 216. In your textbook, please turn to page 51, and we're going to finish up our lecture on this chapter. When I log into 3M, this is, as a reminder, this is the patient information page that initially opens for us, and I am going to click on the red 10 so that it takes me into ICD-10. Then I'll maximize this screen. I want to point out to you that if you click on this text display at the top, you can enlarge the text. And so I have chosen the biggest A for these lectures. When we're looking at the integrated code book, as I've said before, we have the alphabetical index on the left. And actually, if I click on this page, you can see that I can actually choose to go to any section of this code book. And if I actually begin typing a diagnosis, it follows me. So I don't have to type in the entire term. And as I pointed out to you before, if this line turns pink, you have spelled the word wrong, or it's not in the alphabetical index. And you can see that that has turned pink, and so that is not an appropriate term. On the tabular side, we look up codes, we look up diagnostic terms in the alphabetical index. When we find what we're looking for, we click on the code and it takes us to the tabular so we can verify our code. Now, there are 21 chapters in ICD-10-CM. Chapter 21, these are referred to, these are Z codes. These are factors that influence health status. We'll study that chapter in HIM 225. Chapter 20 is the external cause codes, and again we have a couple of chapters. They split up the external cause codes, and we discuss those. Generally, the chapters are broken down by body system, and we're going to go into chapter 1. So this is chapter 1, and you can see that this chapter is certain infectious and parasitic diseases. The range of codes in this chapter is A00 through B99. We have an includes note at the beginning of this chapter. That means that this includes note applies to every code in this chapter. It's not repeated throughout the chapter. It's here at the beginning of the chapter. We have a use additional instructional note that applies to this chapter. We have an excludes 1 and an excludes 2, and because these are here at the beginning of chapter 1, they apply to the entire chapter. If we look at other chapters, we can see that there are instructional notes at the beginning of these chapters, and they do apply to all of the codes that are within the range specified for this chapter. And we can I encourage you just to log in and play around with this and go through and look at all of these chapters. Being very familiar with the content of these chapters is just critical to you assigning the correct code. This is the section list. So within each chapter there are sections. So we have the chapter as the big chunk, and then we have a breakdown by section. And you can see that in this section we start with codes A00 to A09. These are intestinal infectious diseases, and the different sections are broken down for you. HIV, AIDS, human immunodeficiency virus has a category. So these are all the different sections within this chapter. If we go into a section, then we have a category. And these are the categories of codes that are within the section of intestinal infectious diseases. And this section is in chapter 1, certain infectious and parasitic diseases. So for instance, if I click on cholera and I look at cholera, my category is A00, but then I have subcategories. And I have a subcategory of A00.0. And as we discussed before, this red code A00 is not a valid code. It is not the most specific code. And we have to assign codes to the greatest specificity. So we would have to choose a 4-character code. And actually, if I go to the index and I type in cholera, you can see that the default code goes to A00.9, cholera unspecified. You can see these non-specific, the non-essential modifiers for cholera. And then we have that cholera is our main term. These are subterms, and we can see that classic. Cholera codes to A00.0. If we come over here, this description doesn't include classic in it, but we do have a descriptive term, classic cholera, under A00.0. And then we have in the index, due to Vibrio cholera 01, and then we have more specific subterms that take us to these other codes. So we're using the index in combination with the tabular. When we use these arrows, the green arrow will take me up, and the pointing down arrow will take me deeper into the tabular. So if I look at the next category that we have is typhoid and typhoid fevers. Again, A01 is a red code. We can't code that. A01.0, again, excuse me, that is a red code. But we have more specific codes for typhoid fever. And again, if I put in typhoid, I have a lot of terms in parenthesis here. They are non-essential modifiers, and then I have different types of typhoid listed here. Now I want to go to fever and then go to typhoid, and note that we can also find terms typhoid fever complicated by, and we can also find codes here. But the greatest specificity, and sometimes you can look them up both ways, is by going into typhoid. Now, when we're looking up codes in the index, there are some codes that some terms that you just cannot find a code for. For instance, if you put in the term acute, it tells you see also condition. If I put in chronic, see condition. So sometimes you have to be very diligent in your code search. You can't break this, so put in the codes and review them any way that seems to make sense for you. And don't be afraid to play around with this and practice with this. The way that we become proficient at coding is by continually coming in and looking at the index, doing research, that type thing. I'm going to click on the stack of books here. This is the references. And when we go in and we look at the references, we have the I-9 integrated codebook, which we could get to from the patient information screen by just clicking on that first red book. This is a CPT, current procedural terminology, and then this is I-10 PCS, the CMPCS, the integrated codebook, which is what we are in. You also have access to coding clinics. When you have an opportunity, log in and look through these. You will find references in the tabular to Coding Clinic. There'll be a little CC out beside the code, and when we find those, we want to go in and read those. There's a drug reference in here, a medical dictionary, there are anatomy appendices and Elsevier plates. We also have the Merck manual right here. We have an I-10 definition manual, abbreviations, acronyms. This is an excellent resource. This is thousands of dollars worth of resources right here that you have at your fingertips. And I encourage you to walk through these and just take a look at them. This little CC right here tells us that we have a Coding Clinic guidance for this, and you know that the American Hospital Association's Coding Clinic is official guidance. If I click on that CC, it is actually going to take me into Coding Clinic, and then it's going to take me to the specific Coding Clinic that is referenced. Sometimes you'll have many references for Coding Clinic, and this is official guidance, so when you find it in Coding Clinic, that's what you do. In your book on page 55, exercise 3.3, your book tells you to underline the main terms in the alphabetical index. So for decubitus ulcer of the heel, if I go to decubitus, do you see in a non-essential modifier as ulcer, it says see ulcer pressure by site. So obviously I'm going to do that. And I'm at ulcer pressure by site. So in order to find a code, the main term for this would be ulcer. So I can type in ulcer. And if I put in decubitus, it tells me see ulcer pressure by site. And then there are the different sites and the different stages, and we'll talk about that specific coding when we get to that chapter. For number 2, acute anterior wall myocardial infarction. Now we've already looked at acute, and we know that acute is not a term that we can look up. If we look up anterior, anterior is not a term that we can look up. Wall is not a term that we can look up. I can look at myocardial. It tells me to see the condition. So the term that I must look up here is infarct or infarction. You see, I typed in infarction and it turned pink, so I can just backspace out until I get to infarct and then put in myo, and it will get me to myocardium or myocardial. So the main term for this is infarct and then myocardial. You can do the same thing with the rest of these to get an idea of what types of terms you need to look up. In your textbook on page 53, towards the bottom when it's talking about the index to diseases and injuries, in that paragraph that talks about the main terms, it tells you that main terms usually are identified by disease conditions and nouns. The main term is not a body part or a site. So when you're looking for a main term in the alphabetical index, you need to look up the disease condition. Throughout the chapter, you're going to find examples on the different pages. When these examples are referencing codes or conditions, I encourage you to work those. When we're actually coding in the ICD-10 chapters, we will work through those, but look at those examples. Make sure that you understand those and that they make sense to you. If they do not, then let your instructor know. For your homework for Chapter 3, you're completing the chapter review questions. 1 through 27, 28, 29, and 30 are actually for extra credit. So if you answer those correctly, you'll receive extra credit. Otherwise, you will not receive credit for those answers. I also want to talk to you about essential modifiers. When we're looking at a term that has parentheses, those are non-essential modifiers. But actually, when you look at a main term and then you see a subterm, let's look at if we look at appendicitis, we can see that pneumococcal and retrocecal are non-essential modifiers. But if we look at with, perforation, or rupture, this is an essential modifier. These are words. Perforated appendicitis changes the code from K37 to K35.2. Appendicitis with peritonitis changes the code from K37 to K35.3. So non-essential modifiers do not change a code, but subterms that have a specific code are essential modifiers, and they do change the coding. Your question for this lecture, I want you to turn to page 59 and look at exercise 3.5. Page 59, exercise 3.5. I want you to answer questions 1, 3, and 5. So answer questions 1, 3, and 5 on page 59, and then submit the assignment. Thank you, and that will conclude the lectures for Chapter 3.